Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. 4 years into the war, Russia has learned to live with distortion. The GPS lies to you, your phone lies to you, the news lies to you, and eventually you start lying to yourself. In Moscow, air defense spoofing scrambles navigation apps so badly that your car thinks it's vacationing 50 kilometers away. Bad news for introverts, asking strangers for direction is back. Sorry. The future arrived, saw Russia's war, and quietly packed up its things. The invasion of Ukraine has taken a big toll on Moscow and, as a result, on the society at large. So, without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
Nearly 4 years after Vladimir Putin announced the launch of his so-called special military operation, the war in Ukraine has become the central focal point of Russian political and social life. The Kremlin's war against Ukraine, having now lasted longer than the Soviet Union's war with Nazi Germany during World War II, has found its way into all parts of Russian society. In Russian border regions such as Kursk or Belgorod, Ukrainian drone strikes, particularly against Russia's energy infrastructure used for frontline operations, have disrupted daily life. Yet for some in Moscow and St. Petersburg, the war often feels distant, despite sanctions having significantly altered consumer habits and increased prices. More changes are also visible in the information sphere. Since 2022, authorities have tightened laws on supposedly fake news about the Russian army and restricted access to platforms such as Facebook and Instagram, while promoting domestic alternatives. Many Russians now rely on VPN services to bypass restrictions. The Kremlin's criminalization of anti-war statements has also had a profound effect on Russian society, making it nearly impossible to legitimately measure attitudes about the war in Ukraine. Moscow's propaganda machine continues to portray the invasion of Ukraine as denazification, while peddling false narratives that attacks against Ukraine are defensive in nature. At the same time, hundreds of thousands of Russians have left the country since 2022, settling in cities from Berlin to Yerevan. While some have since returned, the outflow has reshaped Russia and narrowed the space for open dissent.
And now, let's zone in on the East-playing portion of our show. Some have argued that public support in Russia for the war in Ukraine would decline as costs mount. Yet, as the war entered its 5th year, Russian public sentiment remains difficult to measure and even harder to interpret. Recent independent polling indicates that just over half of respondents expect the war to end in 2026, while a majority say that if negotiations fail, Moscow should escalate militarily. As always, here's a closer look.
Despite sanctions having squeezed the Russian economy, analysts say that the Kremlin's ideology has had a profound effect on public opinion. Putin's messaging about restoring Russia's global status has resonated with part of the population that is willing to overlook the increasing toll sanctions have taken on the Russian economy. Some independent polls have suggested that Vladimir Putin's approval ratings remain high, although critics argue that polling in an authoritarian wartime environment is inherently unreliable. Experts add that fear of laws supposedly against discrediting the army encourages socially acceptable answers or silence. However, field research suggests that most Russians neither actively oppose nor enthusiastically support the war. Instead, many practice a form of internal emigration, focusing on private life and avoiding politics. Russians are not flocking to military enlistment centers, and visible pro-war symbols often reflect official pressure rather than genuine public sentiment. The gap between official narratives and everyday experience persists. Whether the gap widens further may shape the next phase of the war.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. There's many points to be made about how life for Russians has changed over the past 4 years. Digitally, Russia has gone from managed access to managed absence. YouTube and WhatsApp are gone. Telegram is throttled. The state's own app comes pre-installed like a loyalty card for civilians. VPNs spread like wildfire, outages drag on for weeks, and the country learns the muscle memory of working around blockages. Now, this is how repression modernizes, not with a single blackout, but with a million buffering wheels. Now, economically, the number tells a soothing bedtime story, while the plot twists happen off screen. Low unemployment masks the fact that the war machine has a vacuum of labor and exit doors are clogged with immigrants. Growth has been bought with state spending, oil receipts, and the quiet mortgaging of the future. Arms towns boom, while civilian innovation starves. Russia wanted to be in the AI race. Instead, it's shadowboxing with sanctions and talent fleeting their country. Because, of course, when a state is your biggest customer, you stop designing products that don't help the bottom line. Expropriation used to be rare, now it's a growth industry. Foreign firms were the appetizer, but it's the domestic firms that are the main course. Airports change hands for cents on the dollar, yogurt factories become favors for cronies, the legal system obliges by learning to confuse procedure with permission. Entrepreneurs know that the next investment horizon is like tomorrow. Anything beyond that is speculative. The war has also rewritten the criminal code. Sign a contract and wash away your record. Doesn't matter if it's murder, rape, theft, suspended cases trail behind uniforms like a rotten egg smell. Return home and the violence doesn't always clock out with you. Recruitment, meanwhile, looks less like patriotism and more like payday lending with artillery. Bonuses, salaries once promised a shortcut into the middle class, but inflation and bribery at the front have eroded the math. Finally, the demography is the long fuse on a bomb. Data goes dark when the news goes bad, fertility slumps while migration is coerced and then discouraged. Labor is imported from faraway places because nearby workers are dragged to the front and then scapegoated. The state may ban childlessness as an idea and school forms chant natalist phrases, but they can't cover up the reality. The future is encouraged to be born into a present that cannot promise it continuity. What emerges from 4 years of war is the hardening of state control over the society. Airports that may or may not open, internet that may or may not load, courts that may or may not remember the law. And this is how prolonged conflicts settle into daily life, like a long, steady hum. You stop hearing it, and that is the most dangerous adaptation of all. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Valina Chekharova, founder and Face Geopolitical Consultancy. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Thank you for the invitation.
So it's been 4 years since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and I think a lot of unpredictability took place as Russia didn't really plan for it to last this long. What started as a 3-day special military operation turned into a grueling trench warfare, and we're also seeing the deterioration of its own economy and its geopolitics. Can you help us understand what this calculation has led Russia to, and where is Russia's geopolitical standing 4 years later? And, are there any differences in what they expect, and what are the results?
That is, of course, the big question. So let's start with the big picture, given the background you outlined. Russia has certainly failed to achieve its central objective following the launch of the full-scale war on Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022. What was the central objective? It was not only about political regime change, but it was actually, right from the beginning, it was about the full subjugation of Ukraine. Russia is still denying Ukraine the right of existence as a state, as people, as territory. So in that sense, if you take a look now at the beginning of the 5th year of this war, Ukraine remains a sovereign state. It is still actually controlling around 82% of its territory. Zelensky is still in office. There is functioning government, which is supported by a large amount of the population. And in that sense, Ukraine is a functioning state amid the largest war on the old continent since the end of the World War II. And I would argue this is a big victory for Ukrainian statehood, sovereignty, and for Ukrainian people, despite the significant humanitarian loss and the significant, of course, destruction of the country. But at the same time, let's be also real about where we are in this war. It does not look like Russia is actually planning to stop the war. We don't have a time frame for, let's say, the next months and years to come. When it comes to the Russian goals, I would argue that they are still very much the same, but the time frame has changed. The ongoing war of attrition is actually serving the Russian interests in the long run, as at least as of now, despite the significant humanitarian loss on behalf of Russia. And despite the overheating war economy in the country, it does not look like Russia is actually changing the agenda of its strategic objectives. Now, if we stick to the big picture for a moment, we have to also be clear about the other two strategic objectives beyond Ukraine. The one being the existing security order and architecture in Europe. And I have been arguing right from day one of this war that Russia has also launched a hybrid war on the European security order. I argued that so far, Russia has actually had only partial success. But if you take a look at the intensity, the scale, and the scope of the Russian hybrid warfare on the European security order, of course, we also have to have an open conversation about how to protect our societies, how to stabilize our political systems, and how to prepare our industries and economies for, I would argue, even more intense phase of this hybrid warfare. And the third strategic goal that Russia had right from the beginning of this war, which is why also Russia launched the full-scale war after February 20, when actually the Olympic Games were over in China, was for Russia to come back on the global arena on par with the United States and China. And I argue actually that out of the three strategic goals, the one that Russia is now on its way of fulfilling partially, of course, again, with a devastating loss in mind, because Russia has become highly dependent on China. But in fact, because of its siding with China, because of the dragon bear modus operandi of strategic coordination, now Russia has uplifted its global standing, is relaunching strategic dialogue with the United States in this new triumvirate of great power politics, and is actually thriving from the current geopolitical complexity and from the let's say, shifting international order. So in that sense, it's a mixed picture, but at the same time, no victory in sight for each of the two countries involved in the war.
Can you help us dissect that a little bit? You talked about the great power dynamics, the involvement of China and their deepening relationship. Seeing that Russians pursuing this war have significantly dwindled their own economy, their power, resources, and geopolitical standing, even with foreign relations, how can we argue that this is bringing them closer to the goal of being a geopolitical power on par with the United States and China, as opposed to being over-reliant on it?
So it really depends on the framework which everyone uses to assess the current state of the international relations and the future projection of the world order. I operate, and I have been operating, with a framework of a new Cold War between the United States on the one hand and the dragon bear on the other, which is actually not just China, because most of the analysts who are dealing with a similar framework of a new Cold War are focusing on the US-China strategic rivalry, as well as the decoupling process in all socioeconomic networks and systems. Now, I argue that China cannot compete with the United States on its own. China needs Russia as a disruptive power with its networks, with its ability to actually not just disseminate globally all kind of forms of hybrid warfare, disinformation, propaganda, and so on. This is an experience it had from the first Cold War, but also its disruptive power in terms of boots on the ground, the use of actually military power for the sake of national interests. And then, of course, there are other issues where China, I would argue, relies on Russia. So this kind of asymmetric relationship, as the way it is being described and analyzed right now, is actually one that is still quite valuable for China. Worst case scenario from China's perspective would be actually to have a geopolitical rapprochement between United States and Russia, something that could end in a reverse Nixon-Kissinger approach. Basically, what the United States did during the first Cold War with the Chinese. They started disentanglement, and this was decisive also for winning the first Cold War. It was not the most important, of course, process, but it was decisive to turn, the Chinese, to lure the Chinese away from Russia. Now we are experiencing something similar. So, as I said, worst case scenario from China's perspective would be a geopolitical rapprochement that could lead to this reversed Nixon-Kissinger approach to Russia. We are far, far away from that. We are right now at the first stage of a relaunch of a strategic dialogue between Russia and United States. We don't know for a fact whether this will be successful. We just see some signs of that. So I'm pointing just to a new trend that is manifesting itself. Now, there is another important issue that you need to consider when it comes to analyzing this relationship, and that is that cheap raw materials coming from Russia now flowing to China, especially in the fossil fuels field, but also when it comes to other commodities that are very important for Chinese economy. And this combined also with maritime corridors, because there is a facilitation of a new Arctic maritime corridor between China and Russia in the Arctic, which of course gives China immense opportunities for the future, but more importantly, allows China to become Arctic nation and to facilitate a maritime corridor meant for military power projection and for commerce, which is not controlled by the United States. So it's not that asymmetrical as many actually claim. Of course, on the other side, Russia is completely dependent right now on the comprehensive long-term support coming from China, not only in the field of trade and economy, but also meanwhile in the field of components for its technological and its military technological complex, as well as for the defense sector. So this is a full-fledged coordination and cooperation in all systemically relevant domains, as seen from Russian perspective.
Right, so it does seem like the war has impacted Russia enough to a point that either siding with China or reopening dialogue with the United States, we have to see it playing a more of a junior partner sort of relation. But in the meantime, thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it, and thanks for being with us on Eastern Express. And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. Vladimir Putin has ordered Russia's Federal Security Service and other law enforcement agencies to increase protection for government officials. The directive comes amid what Moscow described as a wave of deadly attacks blamed on Ukrainian intelligence.
Speaking at an FSB meeting on the 4th anniversary of the war, Putin called for heightened security around defense ministry officials, the defense industry, and state and municipal authorities. According to the Kremlin, 2025 saw an increase in what it calls terrorist acts. Putin claimed most were carried out by Ukrainian intelligence and foreign backers. Putin further alleged that peace negotiations were threatened by a supposed plot targeting gas pipelines under the Black Sea that supply Turkey and southern Europe.
An independent tally of Russian military deaths has surpassed 200,000, according to journalists tracking casualties since the start of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The figure is described as a conservative estimate.
The data was compiled by BBC Russian service and the exiled outlet Mediazona. It is based on verified open-source records, including obituaries and court documents, and includes only confirmed Russian citizens. According to the latest update, 57% of those killed were volunteers, mobilized troops, or prisoners recruited from penal colonies. Journalists say that they are still processing data for 2025, which could become the deadliest year of the war. Preliminary estimates suggest more than 90,000 Russian soldiers may have died last year alone.
The United Kingdom has unveiled what it calls its largest sanctions package against Russia since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The measure targets the oil pipeline operator Transneft and dozens of firms accused of exporting crude oil through Russia's shadow fleet.
The announcement was timed to mark the 4th anniversary of the war. Britain's Foreign Office said the sanctions aim to disrupt the financing and revenue streams sustaining Russia's aggression. Officials said Transneft transports more than 80% of Russia's crude exports, despite the company being under US sanctions since 2014. London has also sanctioned 48 oil tankers and 175 companies linked to a major shadow fleet operator. The British government says it has now sanctioned around 3,000 individuals, entities and vessels tied to Russia in total. According to the Foreign Office, international sanctions have cost Moscow an estimated $450 billion.
And that's all on this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.